The morning started just like any other for the young investment banker. The sun was barely peeking through Chicago's towering buildings as he laced up his running shoes, ready for his daily jog before heading to the office. The crisp autumn air nipped at his face as he started his usual route through the quiet streets of downtown. He had always loved these early morning runs, the peace, the solitude, the way the city seemed to hold its breath before the daily rush began. The only sounds were his steady footfalls against the pavement and the occasional distant rumble of early morning trains. As he turned down a familiar alley he used as a shortcut, something unusual caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through scattered papers, but then he heard it again, a soft whimper, almost like a kitten's cry, coming from behind a large dumpster. He slowed his pace, listening more carefully. There it was again, but this time it sounded more distinct, more human. His heart started beating faster, and not from the exercise. Something wasn't right. Moving closer to the dumpster, the cries became clearer. They were definitely coming from inside. He looked around, hoping to see someone else nearby, but the alley was deserted. The smell of rotting garbage made his stomach turn as he cautiously approached. What happened next would replay in his mind for years to come. As he peered over the edge of the dumpster, his eyes met those of a small child. A little boy, no more than 3 years old, curled up and shivering in a thin blanket among bags of trash. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his clothes dirty and inadequate for the cold morning air. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The banker couldn't process what he was seeing. Who would do this? How long had the child been there? His hands trembled as he reached into the dumpster, speaking softly to avoid frightening the boy further. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay. I'm going to help you." The child's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't resist when gentle hands lifted him out. The blanket was damp from the morning dew, and the boy was shaking uncontrollably, from cold, fear, or both. Without hesitation, the banker took off his running jacket and wrapped it around the small, trembling figure. The boy's skin was cold to the touch, and he seemed unable or unwilling to speak. He just stared up with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Holding the child close to his chest, the banker pulled out his phone with shaking hands. As he dialed 911, his mind raced with questions. How could anyone abandon a child like this? What kind of desperation or cruelty would lead to such an act? The dispatcher's voice seemed distant as he reported what he found. He couldn't take his eyes off the little boy, who had now gripped his shirt with tiny, desperate fingers. The child's grip was so tight, as if he was afraid of being left alone again. While waiting for help to arrive, he kept talking softly to the boy, promising him that everything would be okay, that he was safe now. The words felt hollow. How could anyone promise safety to a child who had already experienced such betrayal? Yet something in his voice seemed to calm the boy, whose crying gradually subsided to quiet sniffles. Those 15 minutes waiting for the police and ambulance felt like hours. The banker found himself rocking gently back and forth, a natural instinct he didn't know he possessed. The early morning commuters were beginning to appear on the main street, unaware of the life-changing drama unfolding in the alley. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, he made a silent promise to the child in his arms. He wouldn't let this be just another tragic story, another statistic. Something deeper was stirring in his heart. A connection, a responsibility, a calling he couldn't yet fully understand. Little did he know, this chance encounter on his morning run would be the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would change not only his life, but the life of this abandoned child forever. The approaching sirens marked not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter in a story of hope, love, and the mysterious ways fate sometimes works to bring people together. The next few hours felt like a blur of sirens, questions, and paperwork. The police station buzzed with activity, but the investment banker couldn't focus on anything except the small boy, who refused to let go of his hand. Even when the paramedics had checked him over at the scene, Those tiny fingers had remained firmly wrapped around his index finger. The station's harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under everyone's eyes, making the early morning scene feel even more surreal. Detectives and social workers moved in and out of the room, their voices a mix of professional concern and barely concealed anger at whoever had abandoned this child. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" A kind-faced social worker asked for what seemed like the 100th time. The boy just buried his face deeper into the banker's side. Someone had brought him a warm blanket and a stuffed teddy bear from the station's collection of donated toys, but these offerings remained untouched beside him. The banker found himself answering the same questions over and over. Yes, he had been on his morning run. No, he hadn't seen anyone else in the area. No, he hadn't heard any vehicles. Through it all, he kept one hand on the boy's shoulder, offering silent reassurance that he wasn't alone anymore. A female detective brought them both hot chocolate, serving it in paper cups that were too thin to hold properly. The warmth was welcome, though. The morning's chill seemed to have followed them inside, settling deep in their bones. The boy finally accepted his cup, taking tiny sips while watching everyone through cautious eyes. "We'll need to take him to emergency foster care," one of the social workers explained gently. "It's standard procedure in cases like this." The words made perfect sense, but something felt wrong about them. The banker looked down at the child, who had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep against his arm, small hands still clutching his shirt. The morning light was starting to stream through the station's windows when his phone buzzed. It was his office, probably wondering why he hadn't shown up for the important client meeting. Somehow that other life, the one with spreadsheets and stock portfolios, seemed to belong to someone else now. Hours passed, and still no one had come forward to claim the boy. No missing person reports matched his description. It was as if he had simply appeared in that dumpster, a child without a past. The social workers were making calls, trying to find an emergency placement, but the system was overwhelmed, as usual. The banker watched as they took photos and fingerprints, standard procedure they said, but it felt wrong to see such a young child treated like a case number. The boy had finally spoken a few words. He was thirsty, he was scared, but nothing that could help them understand where he came from or who had left him there. As the day wore on, more people filtered through. A pediatrician, another detective, a child psychologist. Each one asked their questions, made their notes, and left. But the banker stayed. He called in sick to work, canceled his appointments, and remained seated on that hard plastic chair, becoming the one constant in the chaos swirling around this lost child. Something shifted in him during those long hours. Maybe it was the way the boy's small hand would tighten around his whenever someone new approached. Maybe it was the trust in those young eyes when they offered him food and he would look to the banker first, as if for permission. Or maybe it was simply the overwhelming certainty that he couldn't walk away from this. When the social worker returned with forms for emergency foster care placement, the banker found himself speaking before he even fully formed the thought. "What would it take," he heard himself asking, "for me to be the one to take him home?" The words hung in the air, surprising everyone in the room, himself most of all. He had no experience with children, no preparation for this kind of responsibility. His apartment wasn't child-proofed, he knew nothing about parenting, and his life was hardly set up for a small child. But as he looked down at the boy who had finally found peaceful sleep leaning against him, none of those obstacles seemed to matter. The social worker's eyebrows shot up, and she began explaining the complex process of emergency fostering, the background checks, home studies, training required. But for the first time that day, the banker felt completely certain about something. Whatever it took, however long the process, he knew he had to try. This child, who had entered his life in the most unexpected way, had somehow already claimed a place in his heart. Life has a funny way of testing your decisions right after you make them. The moment the banker mentioned wanting to become a foster parent, it seemed like the whole world had an opinion about it. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from family and friends who had heard about what happened. His sister called first, her voice filled with concern. "Have you lost your mind?" she asked. "You work 60-hour weeks. You barely remember to water your plants. How are you going to take care of a child?" He couldn't argue with her logic, but something in his heart told him this was right. That evening, sitting in his modern apartment with its sharp edges and pristine surfaces, he looked around with new eyes. The glass coffee table suddenly seemed dangerous. The stylish open-concept kitchen had no child locks. His home, once a point of pride, now felt more like a bachelor's showroom than a place where a child could grow up. His mother arrived unannounced the next morning, armed with grocery bags and worried expressions. As she cooked his favorite comfort food, something she hadn't done since he was in college, she tried to reason with him. "Sweetheart, I know your heart is in the right place," she said, stirring the pot of soup. "But raising a child isn't like rescuing a pet. This is a lifetime commitment." He sat at his kitchen counter, watching her move around his rarely used kitchen. "Mom, you should have seen him in that dumpster," he said quietly. "How can I just walk away and go back to my normal life, knowing what I know?" The social workers weren't making it easy either. They'd put him through intense questioning about his job, his lifestyle, his support system. They wanted to know about his childhood, his relationships, his financial stability. Each question made him more determined. Yes, he was single. Yes, he worked long hours. But he could change. He would change. His boss was surprisingly understanding when he explained the situation. "Take some time to figure this out," she said. "Your clients will still be here." It was the first support he'd received since making his decision, and it meant more than she probably realized. Late that night, alone in his apartment, he started making lists. Things he'd need to buy: a bed, clothes, toys. Things he'd need to learn: childhood development, proper nutrition, how to handle trauma. Things he'd need to change: his work hours, his apartment layout, his entire life. The magnitude of what he was considering hit him hard. His carefully planned life was about to turn upside down. No more spontaneous weekend trips. No more lazy Sunday mornings. No more quiet evenings with a good book. Could he really do this? Then he remembered the way the boy had held onto his hand at the police station. How he had looked for him every time he woke up, the trust in those young eyes. He thought about what might happen if he didn't step up. Another foster home, another transition, another adult walking away. His friends tried to set him straight over drinks that weekend. "You're in your mid-30s, one said. "You've got a great career. You're finally at a place to really enjoy life. Why would you want to complicate everything?" They meant well, but they didn't understand. How could they? He barely understood it himself. The following week was a blur of paperwork and preparations. He took parenting classes in the evenings, studied child psychology during his lunch breaks, and spent his weekends child-proofing his apartment. His mother, seeing his determination, slowly shifted from worry to support. She even helped him pick out furniture for what would become the boy's room. Each step of the process brought new challenges. The background checks, the home studies, the interviews, it all felt overwhelming. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered that morning. The sound of those quiet sobs behind the dumpster. The feeling of that small, cold hand gripping his finger. Some things in life don't give you a choice, they choose you. As he stood in the newly prepared bedroom, looking at the blue walls and the small bed with its superhero sheets, he realized something profound. Everyone kept asking if he was ready to change his life for this child. But the truth was, his life had already changed the moment he heard those cries in the alley. Everything after that was just details. The first night in the apartment was the hardest. The boy stood in the doorway of his new room, clutching his small backpack of donated clothes, looking lost in the space that suddenly seemed too big, too new, too everything. The banker had spent hours setting up the room, but now he wondered if the superhero bedding and colorful nightlight were too much, too soon. Those initial days felt like walking on eggshells. The boy barely spoke above a whisper, and every sudden movement or loud noise would make him flinch. Breakfast became their first small victory, when the boy finally pointed at the cereal he wanted instead of just nodding at everything offered to him. The nightmares came regularly at first. The banker would wake to quiet sobs echoing through the hallway. He learned quickly that rushing in only made things worse. Instead, he'd sit in the hallway, softly humming lullabies he remembered from his own childhood, letting the boy know he wasn't alone without overwhelming him. Getting ready for press school each morning became their first real routine. The banker learned to lay out clothes the night before, to make lunches that weren't too strange or scary, to double-check backpacks for comfort items. He started waking up an hour earlier just to make sure everything was perfect, to give them time for the inevitable small crises that came with getting a traumatized child ready for the day. One morning, while tying tiny shoelaces, the boy spoke his first full sentence since coming home. "The other kids have mommies," he said quietly. The banker's hands froze for a moment, his heart aching. But before he could respond, the boy added, "But I have you." 5 simple words that made everything. The sleepless nights, the career adjustments, the complete life overhaul. Worth it. They developed their own language of trust. 2 squeezes of the hand meant, "I'm scared." A gentle pat on the shoulder meant, "It's okay." A thumbs up across the playground meant, "I see you. I'm here." Small gestures that built bridges across the gaps of trauma and fear. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm. Instead of hiding under his bed like usual, the boy ran to the banker's room, diving under the covers. They spent the night making up silly stories about cloud giants playing bowling, turning fear into giggles. The next morning, the banker found a crayon drawing on his dresser, 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. Food became another way of building connections. The boy wouldn't touch new foods at first, too scared of the unknown. The banker turned dinner into an adventure, letting him help stir pancake batter on weekends, teaching him to make funny faces with vegetables on his plate. Slowly, the kitchen became a place of joy rather than anxiety. Their first trip to the park was a lesson in patience. The boy wouldn't let go of the banker's leg for the first hour. But then another child offered to share their bucket in the sandbox, and something magical happened. The banker watched as tiny walls came down, as natural childhood curiosity began to overcome fear. The preschool teachers became allies in their journey. They sent home daily reports, not just about activities, but about small victories. The first time he joined Circle Time, the day he shared toys without being asked, the morning he told another child about his new dad. The banker kept every note, creating a diary of healing. Bath time transformed from a battle into bonding time. What started as quick, terrified splashes evolved into epic adventures with rubber ducks and toy boats. The banker learned to accept that he'd end up as wet as the bathroom floor, but the sound of genuine laughter made the mess worthwhile. Each day brought new challenges and tiny triumphs. The first time the boy fell asleep cuddled against him during movie night. The morning he woke up to find small hands trying to make him breakfast. A mess of cereal and milk that meant more than any fancy meal ever could. The day the boy finally felt safe enough to throw a tantrum about bedtime, trusting that anger wouldn't mean abandonment. Sometimes, in quiet moments, the banker would watch the boy playing or sleeping and marvel at how far they'd come. From that terrifying morning behind the dumpster to this, a home filled with stuffed animals, superhero band-aids, and slowly healing hearts. They were building more than trust. They were building a family, one tiny moment at a time. The day the banker decided to pursue adoption started like any other. He was helping the boy tie his shoes for school when his little voice asked, "Can I stay with you forever?" The question hit straight to the heart, and the answer came without hesitation. "I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen." But wanting something and making it happen are 2 very different things. The first meeting with the adoption lawyer opened his eyes to the mountain of challenges ahead. The conference room felt too formal, too cold for a conversation about love and family. The lawyer spread out papers across the polished table, each document representing another hurdle they'd need to clear. Single-parent adoption is complex, the lawyer explained, adjusting her glasses. Add to that the fact that you and the child are of different races, and we need to be prepared for extra scrutiny. The banker felt his stomach tighten, but he straightened his shoulders. He'd faced tough negotiations in his financial career, but this would be the most important battle of his life. The questions started coming from every direction. Social workers wanted to know how he would help the boy connect with his cultural heritage. The court-appointed guardian asked about his support system for raising a child alone. His own parents worried about how society would treat them. Each question felt like a test he couldn't afford to fail. The paperwork seemed endless. Every aspect of his life was put under a microscope. His finances, his health records, his work schedule, even his childhood. He spent late nights at the kitchen table after the boy was asleep, filling out forms until his hand cramped. Each signature brought them closer to their goal, but the path seemed to grow longer with every step. The home visits were the hardest part. Strangers coming in, asking the boy difficult questions, watching their interactions like scientists studying specimens. But his heart swelled with pride when the boy confidently showed them his room, his toys, his artwork on the fridge. "This is where Daddy and I make pancakes," he'd say, no hesitation in calling the banker Daddy anymore. Some of the challenges came from unexpected places. A distant relative of the boy suddenly appeared, questioning the adoption. The banker spent sleepless nights worrying about losing him. But the relative's interest faded as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only added stress and legal fees. The court hearings were a blur of formal procedures and legal terms. The banker wore his best suit, answered every question with careful thought, and tried to project the image of a capable parent. But his most powerful testimony came unplanned, when the boy ran up to him in the courthouse hallway, excited to show him a drawing he'd made in the waiting room. His sister, who had initially questioned his decision, became his strongest ally. She attended every hearing, helped gather character references, and most importantly, provided the boy with the loving aunt he deserved. "I was wrong," she admitted one evening. "You two were meant to find each other." The financial strain was significant. Legal fees, court costs, and adoption expenses piled up. The banker dipped into his savings, cut back on expenses, and even sold his prized sports car. Who needs a fancy car when you can have a minivan full of soccer gear? He joked, but the truth was, he'd have given up everything he owned to make this work. Support came from unexpected places. His coworkers organized a fundraiser to help with the legal costs. His neighbors offered babysitting help during court dates. Even the grumpy doorman of his building wrote a glowing character reference letter, describing how he'd watched them grow as a family. The turning point came during a crucial hearing. The judge asked the boy a simple question: "Where do you feel safe?" Without hesitation, he pointed at the banker and said, "With my dad." In that moment, all the paperwork, all the questioning, all the stress seemed worth it. The banker fought back tears, maintaining his professional composure, but his heart was soaring. Through it all, they kept their evening routine. Stories before bed, silly songs during bath time, weekend adventures in the park. The legal battle might have consumed the banker's days, but he was determined not to let it steal their moments together. Every night, as he tucked the boy into bed, their shared "I love you" reminded him exactly what they were fighting for. 10 years can pass in the blink of an eye, yet somehow feel like a lifetime. The banker, now more comfortable being called Dad than anything else, sat in the bleachers watching his son pitch in the middle school championship game. Looking at the confident 12-year-old on the pitcher's mound, it was hard to remember the scared little boy from the dumpster. Their morning routine had evolved over the years. Gone were the days of struggling with shoelaces and packed lunches. Now they moved around each other with practiced ease, the boy making his own breakfast while Dad packed gym bags and checked permission slips. Sometimes they'd catch each other's eye and smile, both remembering how far they'd come. The first day of middle school had been a big moment. The boy had insisted on picking his own clothes and fixing his own hair. "Dad, you're embarrassing me," he'd said when his father tried to fix his collar. But later that day, he still ran to give him a huge hug after school, forgetting for a moment that he was too old for such displays of affection. Math homework became their special time together. The boy had inherited his father's love for numbers, and their kitchen table often turned into an impromptu classroom. "Show me how you got that answer," his dad would say, and the boy's eyes would light up as he explained his thinking. Those moments reminded the banker why he'd cut back his work hours. No financial success could compare to watching his son grow. They dealt with the stares and questions together. Sometimes people would look confused when the boy called him Dad in public. A few insensitive comments from strangers had led to difficult conversations about family, love, and what makes people belong together. "Family isn't about looking the same," his dad would explain. "It's about loving each other no matter what." Weekends became sacred time. They started a tradition of Sunday morning pancakes, competing to see who could make the most creative shapes. The boy usually won, especially after he figured out how to make Star Wars characters out of batter. His father would pretend to be disappointed while secretly taking photos of every masterpiece. Sports opened up a new world for them. The boy tried everything: baseball, basketball, soccer, and his father was there for every game, every practice, every scraped knee, and triumphant victory. The other parents became friends, and soon their weekends were filled with team barbecues and carpools to away games. The tough conversations came too. Questions about his birth mother, about why he was left that day, about identity and belonging. His father never sugarcoated things, but always made sure his son knew he was loved and wanted. They cried together sometimes, but they also learned to find strength in their unique story. School projects about family trees brought both challenges and opportunities. The boy decided to make his tree show both his birth family, represented by question marks and empty branches, and his chosen family, full of aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins who had embraced him completely. His teacher called it the most thoughtful project she'd ever seen. Their home changed with them over the years. The superhero bedding gave way to sports posters. The toy box was replaced by a gaming console. But some things remained constant: the height marks in the kitchen door frame, the family photos covering the fridge, the sense of safety and belonging that filled every room. They learned to celebrate their differences as well as their similarities. The father found himself learning about different cultures and traditions, making sure his son stayed connected to his heritage. They attended cultural festivals together, tried new foods, and built their own unique family traditions that bridged both their worlds. Through it all, their bond grew stronger. The quiet moments became just as precious as the big achievements. Watching movies together on rainy days, sharing inside jokes that no one else understood, knowing exactly how to comfort each other after a bad day. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were each other's best friend and strongest supporter. The boy's old stuffed bear from the police station still sat on his shelf, a reminder of where their journey began. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd still give it a little pat, not because he needed the comfort anymore, but because it reminded him of how far they'd come together. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, and the father was reviewing college brochures spread across his desk. His son, now a high school junior, had dreams of studying engineering. They'd been planning campus visits, discussing scholarships, and imagining the future together. The phone call came during lunch hour. At first, he thought it was another college admissions office. But the woman's voice on the other end made his heart stop. "I believe you're the adoptive father of the boy who was found in a dumpster 15 years ago," she said softly. "I'm his maternal aunt." His hand started shaking so badly he had to put down his coffee cup. Memories of that cold morning flooded back. The tiny cries, the thin blanket, the frightened eyes. He'd always known this day might come, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The aunt's voice cracked as she explained. She'd been searching for years, following dead ends and false leads. A recent news article about their story had finally led her to them. His mother, she paused, her voice heavy with emotion. My sister, she passed away last month. Before she died, she made me promise to find him. The father sat in his office, listening to a story that seemed both familiar and strange. The aunt spoke of poverty, of mental illness, of a sister who had spiraled into addiction after losing her job. She wasn't always like that, the aunt insisted. She loved him. She was just lost. His mind raced to his son, sitting in physics class right now, probably dreaming about college and his future. How would this news affect him? The stable life they'd built together suddenly felt fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse with one wrong move. The aunt continued talking, sharing details about family medical history, about cousins who'd love to meet him, about old photos she'd had saved. Each word felt like a stone dropping into a still pond, creating ripples that would change their lives forever. I don't want to disrupt his life, she assured him. I just thought he deserved to know where he came from. And there are things he should know about his mother. She wasn't a monster. She was sick, and she made a terrible mistake, but she never stopped loving him. The father found himself looking at the family photos on his desk. 15 years of memories. Baseball games, school plays, camping trips, birthday parties. He was secure in his role as a father, but now he had to help his son navigate this new territory. His secretary knocked on the door, reminding him about an important meeting. But how could he focus on business deals when his world had just shifted on its axis? He rescheduled everything for the day, knowing he needed time to process this before his son came home from school. The aunt had sent an email with her contact information and a few old family photos. Looking at them felt surreal. He could see his son's smile in his birth mother's face, the same crinkle around the eyes when they laughed. These were pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known was missing. Driving home that afternoon, he rehearsed different ways to start the conversation. Should he wait for the right moment? Should he tell him right away? His son was mature for his age, thoughtful and empathetic, but this news would test anyone's emotional strength. Their evening routine felt different that night. As they sat eating dinner, talking about physics tests and basketball practice, the weight of what he knew pressed against his chest. His son noticed something was off. They'd always been able to read each other well. Dad, what's wrong? His son asked, putting down his fork. You've barely touched your food. The concern in his voice, so genuine and caring, brought tears to the father's eyes. This boy, who had come into his life in such an unexpected way, had grown into someone who could sense when others were hurting. The truth sat between them like an uninvited guest. The father took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next would change their relationship forever. Not weaken it, necessarily, but transform it into something new, something that would need to make room for a past they thought they'd never have to face. That evening, sitting at their kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals and memories, the father gently shared the news about the aunt's call. His son sat quietly, fingers tracing the familiar scratches on the wooden table surface, his expression unreadable at first. She was sick, the boy finally asked, his voice smaller than it had been in years. That's why she. He couldn't finish the sentence. The father reached across the table, placing his hand over his son's fidgeting fingers. The touch seemed to ground them both, a reminder of their unshakable connection. The next few days felt like walking through a fog. His son went through the motions of normal life, going to school, attending basketball practice, doing homework, but there was a new heaviness in his movements. Sometimes the father would find him sitting in his room, staring at the old photos the aunt had sent, searching for pieces of himself in those unfamiliar faces. Questions came in waves. Late at night, when the house was quiet, his son would appear in the doorway of his father's room. "Did she ever try to find me?" he'd ask. Or, "What was she like?" The father answered as honestly as he could, sharing what little information he had, holding his son when the answers hurt too much. The hardest part was watching his son struggle with conflicting emotions. "I'm angry," he confessed one evening while they were washing dishes. "But I also feel sad for her." "Is that weird?" The father assured him it wasn't weird at all, that feelings don't have to make sense to be valid. They learned about his birth mother's story piece by piece. She had been a talented artist, the aunt told them. She'd loved to sing and could make anyone laugh with her silly jokes. But mental illness and addiction had stolen those parts of her, piece by piece, until she'd made a choice that would haunt her forever. The father worried constantly. He watched for signs that his son was withdrawing, ready to seek professional help if needed. But his boy surprised him with his resilience. One morning, he found his son adding the newly discovered photos to their family album. "She's part of my story," he explained, "but you're my dad. That's never going to change." School became both a challenge and a refuge. His son's grades dipped slightly as he processed everything, but his teachers were understanding. The father received an email from the school counselor praising his son's maturity in handling such difficult news. Still, he noticed how his boy would hug him a little tighter each morning before leaving for school. The aunt shared medical records, important information about family health history. But with these practical details came harder truths. They learned about the birth mother's final years, her struggles with homelessness, her attempts at recovery, her deep regret. Each piece of information was like a puzzle piece that completed the picture, but also brought its own pain. Some nights, they'd sit together watching old home videos, birthday parties, school plays, family vacations. It seemed important to remind themselves of the life they'd built, even as they learned about the life that could have been. "Look how tiny you were," the father would say, and they'd laugh at his awkward attempts at filming while chasing after a toddler. The boy's friends noticed the change in him. His best friend's mother called one evening, concerned about how quiet he'd become. But slowly, he started sharing his story with those closest to him. "My birth mom was sick," he'd explain, "but I got lucky. I got my dad instead." Their bond grew stronger through the pain. The father worried that learning about his birth mother would create a distance between them, but instead, it seemed to deepen their connection. They talked more openly, shared their feelings more freely, and appreciated their chosen family even more. One night, after a particularly emotional day of looking through old photos, his son looked up from his homework and said, "You know what I realized? It took a lot of love to do what you did. Taking in a stranger's child, fighting to keep me, building this life for us. That's what family really means." Spring brought more than just flowers that year. The father and son stood together in front of a modest gravestone, placing fresh daisies on the ground. It had taken them 3 months to decide to visit his birth mother's resting place. The son had picked the flowers himself, remembering his aunt's stories about how his mother used to love them. "Ready?" the father asked softly. His son nodded, squeezing his hand like he used to do when he was little. They stood there in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The son had written a letter, which he carefully tucked beneath the flowers. Some words, he decided, were meant to be private. Meeting the extended family happened gradually. First came lunch with his aunt at their favorite pizza place. She brought old photo albums and stories that made them laugh and cry. The son discovered he had his mother's artistic talent, something that explained his love for drawing that his father could never quite understand. The first family gathering was overwhelming but beautiful. Cousins who shared his smile, uncles with his same crooked pinky fingers, aunts who cried when they hugged him. His father watched from the sidelines, heart swelling with pride at how gracefully his son handled it all. At one point, his son crossed the room just to stand next to him, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Back at home, they created a new normal. The aunt became a regular visitor, bringing family recipes and stories. Their Sunday pancake tradition expanded to include her special cinnamon rolls. Photos of his birth family found their place on the walls, not replacing but adding to their family story. The son's senior year brought college acceptance letters and big decisions. During one late-night discussion about universities, he shared something surprising. "I want to study psychology," he said. "Maybe I can help other kids who have parents struggling with mental illness." His father had never felt prouder. Their story started touching others. The son began speaking at foster care events, sharing his journey from that dumpster to a loving home. His father watched from the audience, tears in his eyes, as his boy turned their pain into purpose. "Family isn't about where you start," he'd tell the crowd. "It's about who stays." The hardest bridge to build was forgiveness. The son spent hours talking with counselors, processing his feelings about his birth mother. "I'm not angry anymore," he told his father one evening. "I'm sad for her, but I'm grateful too. Her biggest mistake led me to my biggest blessing. You." They started a small foundation together, helping single parents who wanted to adopt. The father used his financial expertise while the son shared their story. Christmas now meant not just their own celebration, but delivering gifts to foster homes and spending time with children waiting for their forever families. Their home became a gathering place for both sides of the family. Birthday parties now included twice as many relatives, twice as many stories, twice as much love. The aunt would often say that her sister would have been at peace knowing how things turned out. One evening, while helping his son pack for college, the father found the old teddy bear from the police station carefully wrapped in tissue paper. "I'm taking him with me," his son explained. "He's seen our whole journey." They both understood it was more than just a stuffed animal. It was a symbol of how far they'd come. The son's graduation speech touched every heart in the auditorium. He spoke about second chances, about how love doesn't always come in the expected package, about how family is both born and chosen. In the audience, his father sat surrounded by their extended family. Birth relatives and chosen family all mixed together, just as it should be. That night, at the celebration dinner, the son raised his glass for a toast. "To my dad," he said, his voice strong and clear, "who taught me that the bravest thing you can do is love someone unconditionally. And to my birth mother, who gave me life twice. Once when she had me, and again when she led me to my real home." Sometimes love builds bridges in the most unexpected ways. Their story, which began with abandonment, had transformed into one of hope, healing, and the incredible power of choosing to love. They had learned that family isn't defined by blood or circumstance, but by the daily choice to stand by each other, no matter what.